Well, good morning, everyone. We will start this webinar. My name is David Chaundy, and I am the President and CEO of the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council, also known as APEC. I am pleased to welcome you to this webinar this morning, Managing Trade Risks and Growing Your Exports, which will be a Q&A with EDC's Peter Hall. This is designed to be interactive. There's no formal presentation here this morning. This is an opportunity for you to ask your questions about what's happening in the global economy, how you might grow your exports, which markets you might want to diversify, how you might handle specific global trade risks that are currently apparent in the world economy. So this is very much for you. There is a chat feature towards the bottom of your screen. You should be able to see a little bubble with three dots, a little bubble symbol. You can just type your question in there and submit that at any time during the session. And Peter Hall will be more than happy to respond to those questions. So again, I just encourage you to take advantage of this. We've done this specifically for your benefit, so we just want to make sure it's of most value and we ask and respond to the questions that you have. So just a few brief comments before we begin about APEC. For those of you who are not familiar with APEC, we are an independent economic research organization. We're based here in Halifax, but our mandate is to help promote economic progress across Atlantic Canada. We do that through our own monitoring of what's happening in the Atlantic economy, what's happening in the global economy, and how that might impact us. We publish that research through various publications and through different events and conferences. And then we also look at what are the policy ideas, what are the considerations that we need to think about to help strengthen the economy. And so you would have seen some examples of that last week in commentaries we released on interprovincial regulation, some recent research we released on firms in the digital technology space. So if you're not a member, we certainly encourage you to reach out. You can visit our website and find out more about APEC and how you might join us and get access to some of the information. I would just like to let you know about two upcoming events. We have another webinar happening next week. This is on digital technology firms in Atlantic Canada. My colleague Patrick Brannan will be presenting the work that we released last week. So if you want to sign up for that, it's a free webinar happening on October the 2nd. So just respond, go to our website, and you can register in advance for that. And then also just to let you know, we have our annual Outlook Conference, our Business Outlook Conference happening the first week in November. You see the dates here happening in all 4 Atlantic provinces. It's a morning conference. We'll be talking specifically about labor shortages and how we respond to those. We'll also be sharing our business and economic outlook for each province and the region. So again, registration is now open. So I certainly encourage you to visit our website and you can register online for those sessions. So now it just gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker and presenter this morning. Peter Hall is the Vice President and Chief Economist with Export Development Canada. He joined EDC around 15 years ago, but he has over 25 years of experience in economic analysis and forecasting. He oversees all of EDC's economic analysis, their country risk assessments, and does lots of presentations and speaking and provides advice to businesses around Canada, across Canada, talking about what's happening in the global economy. So I'm just going to stop sharing and start my video. And Peter, if you want to start your video. Peter, welcome.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
That's great. Well, we have almost an hour to respond to some questions. So again, I'd like to invite anyone online. Your questions are anonymous, so just type in your question, use that little chat bubble that you'll see at the bottom of your screen, send in your questions, and we will respond to those as we can. So again, please take advantage of that. But Peter, while people are just typing their questions and responding, you track what's happening in the global economy, you look at risks, it's a big part of what you do. What are the key issues that you and your team at EDC are most concerned about, are most paying attention to at this point in time?
Well, David, there's a lot to be concerned about. Clearly, the last 11 years have not been the easiest for the global economy, from, a massive bubble in the economy to a huge recession to very extraordinary policy measures to keep us going, and a lot of very meager growth at that point in time. There's been lots to worry about over that. what's concerning is that the broad concerns of a global community are reaching a crescendo. You know, they're actually increasing when this long after a recession, they should be declining. And so we measure that in the rise of global populism at this point. It has been on an inexorable rise over this period of time. And that is completely counterintuitive. If the world was doing well, people would be gainfully employed, unemployment rates would be low, and indeed they are low, and people would be far more content. So this upsurge of populism has actually given rise to, or it's manifesting itself in a challenge, a serious challenge to the architecture that has been put together around many things, post-war institutions, but primarily international trade. So the thing that we worry about the most really is the existential threat to international trade as we know it, the architecture of globalization. And so we have been on a very long run of making free trade agreements, bilateral, multilateral agreements with many nations. Canada was a pioneer in this with the United States and then with Mexico, and then a torrent of free trade agreements, double taxation treaties, investment protection agreements, and the like were going on and increasing over time. This seems to have sort of arrested that, and primarily the acrimony between the United States and China, that's really the flashpoint for all of this. But we see it manifest in actions that are taken against other countries, a general rise of protectionism, nationalism, isolationism, and some are cashing in on that. Brexit is also a huge concern. So I'd say that the paramount issues of concern to us at the moment are the US-China trade dispute and Brexit.
So we do want to come back and maybe tackle those two specific issues particularly. But just beyond the trade risk, when you look at the global economy, because we are a nation of exporters, what we export very much does depend upon demand across the global economy. What do you see in terms of kind of your outlook for the global economy, particularly in terms of markets that would be most relevant for Atlantic or Canadian exporters? Where do you see kind of things evolving over the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, it's a great follow-on question, David, because really our greatest concern is now impacting the world economic growth quite substantially. Every central bank, every major central bank is lining up behind this view that we have a two-speed economy at the moment. The domestic internal economies of both the United States and Western Europe are fundamentally strong and have the capacity to continue running those economies such as they are. Unemployment rates are low. The rate of job creation has been up until recently very high. And so the pressures arising in the economies flip over to business investment and the international trade side of things, and you get a very different picture. If one is rosy, the other is the exact opposite. And we rarely see this kind of two-speed economy happening. So our outlook for the world economy, like those of others, has soured significantly in the last while, and we're seeing the probability of an economic downturn globally actually rising quite substantially just over the last few weeks and months. And so any business person that is doing international business, whether that's Canadians or Atlantic Canadians doing business in the United States or further beyond, that growth is now at risk at the moment. And it's tragic because in our view, it doesn't need to happen. It's this trade acrimony that's at the center of the weakening in international trade and investment decisions. When people do not know what the architecture of trade is going to be going forward, well, they're not going to invest into that. They don't know what country is going to be a safe place to go to. They don't know when a tariff wall is going to be raised up against another country. They simply do not know what to do. So this is an investment hesitation. And again, it's completely unnecessary. Businesses prior to this were facing rising capacity utilization rates, a key signal that for the first time in the post-recession period, businesses were ready to invest normally. They have been investing at a very subpar rate. So this is bringing the world economy to a halt. and it's a very disturbing development.
So let's kind of pick up on some of those themes and talk about some of the specific markets. One of the big issues last year, of course, for Canadians was what's going to happen to NAFTA. That was, we know we heard that here in Atlantic Canada. Big concern. Send some of what I we just that come in.
Well, that's not an easy one to answer. The Wall Street Journal this morning is talking about the Democrats actually wanting to ink a deal and not stand in the way of this one. What they have to pay very careful attention to, and this is by their own estimation, Labor is not very happy with the USMCA as it has been negotiated. They have felt all the way along that NAFTA has stolen jobs from them, that there has been a great drain to Mexico. They believe the Ross Perot story of the giant sucking sound, and that many of them have been casualties of that very significant and sustained job drain. The interesting thing about that is that the United States has faced periods of very low unemployment rates with high rates of labor force participation over the course of this deal. I think that labor is perhaps capitalizing on the populism that exists at the moment and the generally held belief that all of our woes inside of our economy are somebody else's fault. And of course, the president has squarely blamed Mexico and squarely blamed China and others like them for this phenomenon. And so labor is unhappy with things the way they are right now. They would like to get a few more concessions, and the Democrats do not want to alienate them. Obviously, as an election is impending at the moment, they need that constituency. So it's a very sensitive time. So there is this tension inside of the negotiations. Everybody wants, it seems, the deal to be done. We want to move forward from this. And with every passing day, it's painfully obvious that lack of resolution on trade issues is really costing us in terms of growth. So the pressure is building, but it's still not clear how quickly this will be resolved. We have been expecting all the way along that by the end of this year, there would be a deal. Now it seems as if the legislative clock is running out, and so that view is at risk.
And just to kind of build upon that, we've had NAFTA in place for many years. It's provided a lot of stability and security around the US, but every now and again, the softwood lumber or other disputes with the US kind of flare up. Now we seem to have had a bigger kind of disruption to that stability in terms of Canada-US trade relations. How should Atlantic firms or Canadian firms approach the US going forward, given that whether we stay with NAFTA, whether we get this agreement fully enforced, it's raised some risks about the stability and security of that relationship. So how should a Canadian firm think about managing that risk going forward? Is that something that needs to be part of their planning going forward that maybe it wasn't over the last decade?
Well, it's an excellent question, David. Yet clearly we're having to think very differently about our number one relationship. And so to that, I would say, there is a short run response and then there is a longer run response. This is a market that we have been very friendly with for a very long time. We have key resources that in an increasingly politically unstable world are very politically safe for the United States. They're right on the doorstep. I think of oil and gas. I think of the resources that we have in terms of food, forestry resources, minerals. The United States is a huge customer for all of these of us. So there is that codependency that will last through any kind of acrimonious period that we actually have. There is nothing on our radar screen that suggests any kind of marked deterioration politically in our relationship with the United States. It's a very solid relationship. So in the longer term, we can operate pretty much normally in terms of the actual trade flows that are going across the border, and of course in terms of our ability to invest in the marketplace there and to attract investment into our market. For now, while we have the impending signing of a free trade agreement and sort of sporadic use of things like Section 232, security concerns being raised on things like steel and aluminum, that's now beyond us. Hopefully that sets a precedent for non-returning to that kind of thing. We've perennially had the softwood lumber agreement. We've had other disagreements with respect to foodstuffs like pork, and occasionally other items as well. Autos have alternatively come in and then left the discussion and so forth. So I believe we will always have discussions with the Americans about these individual issues. But on the whole, from the initial American bargaining position on a number of key issues, the US Trade Representative backed away from those things in an extraordinary way in the lead up to actually getting the deal. And so I think that Canada can be quite satisfied with the way that we argued on the other side of the table, negotiated strongly that position, and that can be a sign of how well our relationship is and will go forward.
Okay, that's great. So again, I just encourage people we are getting some questions flowing in now from people online. So again, just use the chat feature to send your questions. There's lots of things we can talk about here, but let me just switch to a couple of questions that have come in. One of them is, given the demographics, decreasing or stagnant consumer purchasing power, and technology disruptions in the developed world, do you see any significant GDP growth in the near future?
Well, actually, that is a very good question that cuts right to the heart of economic theory. Many are believing that the developed world is going into a period of prolonged stagnation because, of course, the baby boom is over and the generations to follow weren't quite as procreative as generations past. We just don't have the same kind of follow-on population as we had before. Well, Canada's not alone when it comes to this. The entire developed world is caught up in this demographic maelstrom. In fact, if you like, the United States is the one that's almost least touched by this because due to its own fertility rate and its immigration numbers, it has actually been able to organically continue increasing its population at a respectable rate. Western Europe has already turned the corner. And then there are key emerging markets like China and Russia that have significant declines in their population in the future. And so that's a great weight, let's say, on overall world growth. So how does that relate to artificial intelligence and technology actually driving us forward? Well, if we can actually leverage very intelligent machinery to do our work for us in an environment where we are running out of labor, well, it's almost the perfect solution, isn't it? That can actually enable us to enhance our productivity growth going forward. You know, I recognize that there will be a disruptive period in the middle as we change the way that we do business. That's what industrial revolutions are all about. And managing through that period of time will be critical to how it is that we actually go forward. But the technology itself is already in place. It already exists. And to not leverage it would actually be to consigning ourselves as the developed markets of the world to having a backbench, and others that would leverage this would actually take over. So I believe that there is equipment can indeed launch us into a period of new and higher growth going forward. I'm not one of those who believes that we are consigned to a very negative view of the future, simply because we don't have more people coming into the picture. I believe that the leveraging of technology can actually enhance the average wealth of the population that still exists very considerably.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And last year at our Business Outlook conference, we were talking very much about these technologies, and we're doing some, for those of you online, we are doing some current beginning to model what does Atlantic Canada's demographics look like, and how much is of a labor crunch are we going to face, but the opposite side, as you rightly said, is how much is productivity going to respond due to new investments, due to new technologies, and how does that help kind of balance that equation? So we're hoping to do more work on how that plays out in Atlantic Canada. There is a follow-up question here, just we're talking about kind of slower growth and the risks of that. If there is a global recession, or at least a significant global slowdown in the next year or two, how well is Canada positioned to weather that, and what would be some of the main risks that Canada would be specifically facing in that type of scenario?
Well, again, a very good question. I do want to emphasize that our base case forecast at EDC here is for no recession. And that, we believe, is the most reasonable, the highest probability outcome that we face at the moment. And really, it comes down to decisions, political decisions. Will we actually have agreement on the trade acrimony or not? And if we have no agreement, well, it's the lack of agreement that's driving us into this negative growth situation worldwide. How is Canada fixed to weather that? Well, we did extremely well when the Great Recession occurred. We had fundamental domestic strength. And there's a long story behind that. But we did not enter the marketplace in the same way as the United States and as the rest of the developed world actually did. We had that fundamental strength. This time around, the picture is a little bit different. Our indebtedness ratios right across the country are very high. And we are in a situation where our markets, our housing markets, are quite frothy. So that's not going to lend support if recession comes to Canada from outside of our borders. And I want to be really, really clear about that. For Canada, there's also no need to go into recession, but it's really this thing that's happening outside of our borders over which we have no control. And that would be the thing that would actually tip us in that direction. And so again, no need for it to happen. But right now, with the slowing going on, momentum is not in our favor. And we're really looking for a situation where some of those large trade friction points are actually solved.
So we have another question that's come in from one of our listeners. This is specifically around the kind of the US and some of the trade disruption we're seeing. Will the Trump administration's intent to avoid judicial appointments to the WTO dispute settlement system contribute to slowing economic growth?
Well, that is, I think, part and parcel of the trade acrimony that we are seeing at the moment and the challenging of institutions. I believe that essentially what is going on south of our border is really an attempt to get better deals on all fronts. It's not about the destruction of the system itself. And the way that the CUSMA deal was negotiated is the greatest example of that. There isn't a desire to blow up the system, to tear it up, to be done with arrangements that are purported to be the worst kind of arrangements ever made between nations like ourselves. Well, the distance between that and what is now one of the best arrangements between nations like ourselves isn't very great. And so if the idea then is to improve, to modernize, to upgrade deals that are already in existence, and if we can transpose that across to the discussions that are being had with the WTO, obviously the United States is a great payer into the systems, the institutions that were architected in the post-World War II period of time. They wield a lot of influence. Our view is that this is about improving those, not about destroying them. So ultimately, in the short run, it may cause confusion with respect to world growth. In the long run, it actually is possible to enhance world growth by getting things that are imperfect a little bit more perfect.
So again, I think part of what I hear you saying, a lot of these specific things are negotiating tactics rather than kind of goals in themselves, that we're trying to use leverage by threatening certain things and use that to maybe negotiate some better outcomes to satisfy a domestic population base. So we have lots of time for further questions. Again, I encourage you to join others and submit your questions through chat. But let's just maybe pivot away from the US for a moment and talk about Brexit. From the UK, I kind of have great concerns about what I see happening in the UK and how that's going to unfold. Like, what's your scenario here for how Brexit might unfold over the next few weeks, or whether we have this hard exit or not? And I know there's a lot of politics happening in the UK around this, but then from a more practical point of view, how do firms navigate this? We've seen a number of firms export to the USA. We've seen some that are now investing in Europe in terms of developing their own global supply chain. So there's a lot of uncertainty about the economy. David. So how do businesses manage that uncertainty, given that some are in the UK, some are exporting to the rest of the EU? There's a lot of dynamics at play there. Can you help us walk ourselves through what might happen, or what are the risks, and how businesses should best be thinking about managing some of those risks right now?
Sure. Sorry to cut you off there, David. The screen froze up on me for a second there. I thought you were done your question. Such a relevant issue to many Canadian businesses, and obviously to Atlantic Canadian businesses as well, with a great presence in and a market share of the United Kingdom. It is used, by the way, as a launch point to the continent for many Canadian businesses who have invested there for that very purpose. And it, of course, is our #1 export market in the EU by far. So there's a lot on the table. There is a lot at risk as a result of what's going on at the moment. Let me first answer what our position has been all the way along inside of our forecast. We subscribe to the Bank of England's view of a no-deal Brexit, i.e. the UK economy sort of falling off the cliff, as costing the UK economy somewhere between 5 and 8% of GDP. Now, were that to occur, and we believe that that would be the outcome over a relatively short period of time, it would sort of make the Great Recession look like a walk in the park to the average Briton. I mean, this would be a very substantial reduction in overall welfare. There would be soaring unemployment rates as a result of this. At the extreme, they would be up into double-digit rates. While the UK worked through this period, there would possibly be capital flight out of the UK, particularly in the financial sector. And this all leads us to believe that if it is so evident that the costs are going to be substantial, that no politician of whatever stripe in their right mind would want to take their people down that road. And so really the different positions inside of the UK are also about getting a better deal. And really that is how the people in the UK voted inside of the referendum. When it boiled down to the key issues that the average person in the United Kingdom was concerned about with respect to the relationship with continental Europe, it really came down to the fact that much money was going from the UK into Brussels, and there wasn't really an appreciation of what value the United Kingdom was getting for that. The second issue was really the immigration issue. There was a massive influx through the migration provisions inside of the EU Charter that caused a great influx into the UK all of a sudden. And the absorption of that was problematic in the view of some. And remember, this is a very divisive thing. There's just a 50-50 about this. So some, almost half of the people are totally fine with this. The other half are really not fine with it. And it's been a great polarizing effect. Okay, so what are the outcomes then? What do businesses actually think about with respect to the go forward plan? Well, our base case says, look, The idea is to get a better deal with continental Europe. It's not to destroy the deal. It's not to undo the trade provisions that have been made between the United Kingdom and the EU. Now, let's just sound all one-sided. The EU has a powerful incentive as well to negotiate with the UK. All is not well on the continent at this particular point in time. Germany is very close to recession. The Purchasing Managers Index numbers that came out yesterday went from bad to worse. The manufacturing sector in Germany is in terrible shape right now, and buyers are saying that the prognosis for the next 6 months is very, very poor. When you look at the entire EU, the services industries collectively are very close to the gross decline mark, again, through the Purchasing Managers survey results that we saw just yesterday. And these have been decelerating. When a service sector starts to decelerate, boy, you know you've got some real problems. And so economy after economy, the economic situation together with populism on the continent suggests to me that it's in Brussels' best interest to talk with the UK to negotiate a deal to demonstrate that the contract is not fragmenting at this point in time to keep together what is a very efficient trading arrangement. So that's our view as we go forward. Again, there's a short run view, which is very dangerous, and a longer run view that sees all of this coming together. And the long run may not be as far down the road as you might think.
So let's just pivot, and we've got another couple of questions that have come in, but let's just kind of deal with the last kind of big issue or a country-specific issue, which is around China. We know there's an ongoing kind of US-China trade dispute, which you've already alluded to in terms of impacts on the global economy. We've talked about China for a long term as this is a huge market. It's been growing very rapidly. There's lots of opportunities, but for Atlantic exporters, we are on a much smaller scale. Issues around intellectual property and then kind of some of the current trade and other disputes that are impacting relations with China. So for an Atlantic firm that's thinking about China or looking to China, what's some of your advice about how we look at that as an opportunity and how we manage some of those risks that are apparent?
Well, this is, you know, next to the United States, probably the most important question that can be asked just from the perspective of demand growth in the future. Lecture on this, they are already out there and saying, look, China is our #1 customer. These are substantial firms, well represented in the seafood industry, that have been pursuing this market in a very visionary way for many decades and are now capitalizing on those very tenacious investments over a number of years and are seeing explosive growth to the point where, you know, China has left behind the United States in #1 position and is running away with that as we go forward. The first consideration is demand. China, at 1.4 billion people, with an addition to their middle class equaling Canadian population every year, defies description. The demands there that will rise over time as this increasingly wealthier population consumes the things, the higher value added products that we generate is almost beyond description. So let me try to put it into numbers. If the same trend growth in merchandise exports from Canada to China continues into the future, then China will be Canada's #1 customer for everything in 26.3 years. That's a staggeringly short period of time. And it very strongly suggests that if you don't have a China plan, you better start working on one very quickly, because the shifts in demand are really turning the balance of demand much more towards emerging markets writ large and to China in particular. So demand is the greatest consideration. Managing the risks of that marketplace, we hope, is going to become less complicated, because as China is by the rest of the world being held to greater and greater account on things like intellectual property protection, trade in services, trade in agricultural products, non-tariff barriers, currency manipulation, all those things. the rest of the world has lost patience with China on and are sort of watching things at the moment to see if there will be any change. And definitely the advent of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and China's nascent interest in that deal suggests that China is at least entertaining changes that will open it up more in terms of a conformity, let's say, to global standards on these very key issues. But that's not the status quo now, and one needs to go into the Chinese market with eyes wide open. And so what firms in Canada have found the best approach is to go inside the supply chains of companies that actually have experience at shielding their intellectual property there. So going in with a large multinational, having a joint venture partner that understands the marketplace well, being able to deal with a local firm that is trustworthy and has been verified by other sources as well. But not stopping there, understanding that counsel is very important to have. Counsel from other businesses that are doing work there, counsel from the legal profession, from the accounting profession, those who understand tax and regulations really well. It's essential to go in fully understanding as fully as possible what it is that you are getting into inside of the Chinese market. Many have done it. Many have done it very successfully. So for every one of those, there are probably 10 horror stories that make the airwaves right now. But those who are going in intelligently with great plans are actually coming out doing very well inside of that space. Learning how to navigate that market properly is essential to, I believe, the future of Canadian exporters as we go forward.
So building on that, I know you have EDC and you have talked a lot about emerging markets and looking at the potential and thinking about where we need to kind of reposition. So China is obviously one of those big markets that's been apparent for some time. But a question from one of the listeners is, are there other fast-growing markets that are open to trade that we should be paying more attention to? So we've talked a bit about China, but are there some other key markets that you think we should be, or Canadian exporters or Atlantic exporters in particular, should be starting to take a look at or thinking about as potential opportunities?
Absolutely. I would, as a great proponent of trade diversification, never want to leave the impression that I was overemphasizing one economy over the other. I'm looking at them all at their merits, but diversified trade is the best way to go forward, in the event that you get into some kind of temporary trouble with one particular economy. And of course, that threatens your entire business plan. So thankfully, there are many economies with rapid rates of growth that are highly promising markets. I look at the markets of Southeast Asia, and some of the newcomer markets are places like Vietnam, which only holds itself back because it can't expand infrastructure fast enough to accommodate the growth that is coming its way. And even greater potential opportunity is the Indonesia market. Now, it's thorny, it's difficult to deal with in a lot of respects. With respect to regulation, it has fallen afoul on the corruption scale in the past as well. But bear in mind that this is an economy that has a population that rivals that of the United States. Much of it is or underemployed, and so there's a labor force there that can be leveraged very well. The makeup of the Indonesian market is very similar to the Canadian market in terms of its resource endowment. And so there are a lot of synergies between our market and theirs. But I would say that another feature of Indonesia is that China is a very active investor in Indonesia. Now, the reason for that is very interesting to me, because China is actually running out of its vast army of surplus population. Coastal wage rates in China since at least 2005 have been rising at an 18 to 19% pace every year. And so they've got a real labor issue at the moment. Where China is sending its investment dollars to Indonesia is in the manufacturing sector. It's, from what we can tell, the largest destination of Chinese foreign direct investment for manufacturing purposes. Well, when that kind of thing occurs, you know that there is going to be growth inside of the Indonesian marketplace. There is going to be a moving up the value added curve there in a way that creates a lot of prosperity that I'd like to see more Canadian firms being a part of. Now, let's not forget the huge populous subcontinent of India. And that's a market of the future if there ever was one. And so what we are seeing are dual forces that we believe are going to launch India forward, and indeed are doing that right now. So the one force is really the aspirations of average Indian people. And even those that are in the uber poor class, many of them earning wages from agricultural systems that really are equivalent to 18th and 19th century methods of farming. There's a lot of penury there, but even these are getting a hold of devices that allow them to see what's going on in the rest of India and in the rest of the world. And this is stoking aspirations inside of them. That's a very powerful force. The second one is the world's need for people. If you want people, you go to a place where people are. And if you need to take your manufacturing there because you've run out of people, well, India is one of the greatest places to go. So I believe that the forces from within and the forces from without coming together to actually bring India, sort of into the economic center far more than it is right now, make it a great market of opportunity going forward.
And again, so just to build upon kind of some of the markets you talked about, I know we have some businesses participating and listening to this webinar. We also have some people from different government agencies that their job is to try and help our local exporters get into new markets, help them grow and scale up and diversify. Do you have some specific advice either for the companies or for some of the government agencies looking to help grow companies, get them exporting, encourage them to look at new markets, help facilitate some of those transitions? What would be some of your key advice either for the businesses or for the government agencies that are looking to nurture some of that growth and help firms think about some of these opportunities, whether it's in the US, whether it's in China?
You seem to have lost the line. Are we okay?
I think you just froze temporarily, Peter. Hi, Peter, can you hear me?
Loud and clear. So sorry about that.
That's okay. So just to let everyone know, we have lost Peter video, but we do have him back online. Again, I apologize for technical issues there, but very pleased that you can join us. So we do have a couple of questions that have come in, Peter, so we'll try to go to those first, and then we'll maybe have a question. One of the questions that has come in is around for some Canadian exporters, the US-China trade dispute has resulted in higher exports to China. However, is there a flip side to this in the sense of risks for Canadian businesses emanating from the US-China trade dispute?
Sorry, can you just repeat the second half of that question? Sorry about that, David.
So some Canadian exporters have benefited from the US-China dispute.
Right.
Is there a flip side to this, that there are now also some risks to Canadian businesses because of the US-China trade dispute beyond some of the global economic implications that we discussed earlier?
Well, I do believe that some have obviously capitalized on the situation. There has been concern that resolution with the United States and China might cut into those or take that benefit away. What we have found in practice is that actually with the reaching of an agreement, there has been a discovery process. And so buyers in China would not necessarily flood back to their U.S. suppliers in a hurry. They've discovered new suppliers. And if you are reliable and if you are high quality, and if they like you, they are likely to continue doing business with you as well. Now, so that's one possible answer to this. There is a permanence to some of the new business that has been attracted in these acrimonious times. China, like the rest of the world, is looking for diverse sources of supply. And so if it discovers good ones, it's obviously going to keep up some of those relationships. And of course, the growth there, the dependence on the rest of the world, is rising at an extraordinary rate every year. So they're more than likely to nurture and to enhance those relationships as time goes forward. The actual upset, though, can get in the way of a North American supply chain that has actually been feeding the Chinese market. And of course, the lack of resolution is having a more direct effect than the effect on the rest of the world. Now, shipments of a U.S. sourced good with Canadian products embedded inside of that is a bit of a problem, or is compromised. The growth has gone down. It might indeed be in decline. I'm not sure if that's where the question was headed, but clearly, until we get resolution, there is some disruption that's actually going on there. How permanent that would be in the event of resolution just remains to be seen. It's hard to know, how much permanent damage might be done to bilateral relationships as a result of what's going on at the moment between the U.S. and China. It's a good question.
Great. No, that answers the question. Had a response on the chat feature, so thank you. This is the last call for questions. We are getting close to time, so any final questions you have? One that did come in was just around climate change. We're hearing a lot, of course, around climate change and a lack of action, perhaps, on behalf of governments that we're hearing in the news over the last few days. What's your sense of how climate change is or could be impacting the global economy or policy responses to that? Do you have a view on, as you look forward in terms of your economic forecast and what's happening, what's the role of climate change and responses to climate change having in terms of, again, global trade, the global economy, and opportunities for Atlantic and Canadian firms?
Well, it's a question that is with us, is not going away anytime soon. And as we see the current demographic overturn happen inside of the economy, there is a younger set that are coming in that are far more concerned about these things than their forebears. So I don't see any lack or any diminution of the debate itself. But my opinion, I wonder if it really matters inside of all of this. Yes, I and my team are doing a substantial amount of reading on this. Export Development Canada is highly concerned about climate change issues and has directed a lot of capital towards climate initiatives. It's very important to us in our overall vision and our policies. So we will continue as an organization to further clean tech solutions and a cleaner environment. But I think that what is perhaps most interesting in terms of recent developments is the attitude of countries that believed that they had the right to pollute to the same degree as the developed world did when it was developing into an industrialized world. And so emerging markets have said, look, no fair. You guys have polluted the environment. You are allowed to do that in order to get your feet on the ground, economically speaking. You can't expect us now to have first world standards around our environmental protection. That was the old approach, generally speaking, of many emerging markets. 2008 was a great gift to the environmental movement in the sense that large polluters realized that the very long period of global growth that we saw from the early 1990s right through to 2008 when the Great Recession occurred, that extraordinarily long period of time was a time where industrial output in places like China got to the point where environmental management was becoming a key public policy issue. For the average person on the street, they were understanding how much less breathable air there was and that potable water was harder and harder to come by. And there were other environmental considerations that were political stability issues. And so how was the Great Recession a gift? Well, the outpouring of global stimulus, which as a share of GDP was much more dramatic inside of the emerging world, substantial amounts of that were actually apportioned to deal with the growing and increasingly politically concerning environmental issues. And as those hundreds of billions of dollars were devoted to cleaner tech solutions, of course, a general adage out there is you want to throw a whole pile of an absolutely phenomenal amount, a deluge of money at a particular problem. Somebody is going to come along and invent very creative solutions and get what were very high average and marginal cost solutions down the average cost curve, down the marginal cost curve, make it much more affordable for the rest of the world. And now we see a China that is cranking out acres and acres of solar panels every hour, football fields worth of them every hour, and exporting to the rest of the world because of technologies that they have developed there and because of mass production. Well, that's just one little example of how it's not just a developed world thing anymore, it's a worldwide thing. And I think we can take great comfort in the fact that an entire industry is getting to the point where it doesn't rely on subsidies anymore. It's actually getting to the point where there is very good business sense inside of all of that they are doing. So, if that gives anybody cause for optimism over the future, the fact that it's sort of an all-in thing, it's not just, those who see and believe what is going on that are having an influence on things. This is a shared concern now on a very broad base. And so that's the sense in which I don't think it's going away. It's becoming embedded as a part of the cost of doing business. And it's not sort of a tit for tat that says, well, you can be lower cost, I have to be higher cost. No fair. It's now an all-in type situation. It's a much more level playing field. And I believe that that will lead to a great improvement of environmental conditions in cities that were highly compromised before.
That's great, Peter. So we're almost at time. I just want to kind of go back to one final question where I lost you. I know there's quite a few government agencies who are supporting export on the line, as well as some of our exporters. So in kind of, if you had some kind of quick kind of closing advice for the government agencies looking to grow this region's exports or businesses looking to advance themselves internationally, kind of what would be your kind of top your big advice or your top kind of quick 3 points that you want to kind of get them to think about to help grow this region's export base, and then we'll conclude.
Very good. So we are looking at a world that I believe is getting stronger in terms of globalization, not weaker. And it doesn't seem like that is the case at the moment. And so in terms of growing one's export base, one might be tempted at this juncture to stick with what is tried and true, to stick with traditional markets, not to venture out into riskier areas. And, as a first guess, that's a very intuitive response to take. But I believe that this is actually a great window of opportunity for exporters. And so what we have been sharing with exporters right across this country is, look, when the chips seem down for everybody and other businesses are running away from an increasingly risky international picture, isn't this a great opportunity to actually run into that? When others are running away from good, viable, bankable business, if we actually believe, and we do believe in our heart of hearts, that resolution is inevitable, if that's the case, then pursuing business now when others are running away from it actually gives Canadian and Atlantic Canadian businesses a leg up. We have heard businesses over and over saying to us, you know what, you're absolutely right. We have been able to get into supply chains that we had only previously dreamt of being a part of. Why? Because their other suppliers are running away from them. They're afraid of what it is that's going on. We've got a product that they like. We've established a relationship. We're now in there, and we agree with you there's going to be resolution. So piece of advice number one is go for the gap. Go for it, with eyes wide open, doing the proper calculations. Don't throw caution to the wind, but understand that if resolution is going to happen, somebody is creating a gap for you, and you can actually run into that gap. So government agencies can actually coax businesses into doing this, finding those opportunities, hearing about them, helping them actually to latch on to this new and exciting business. The second thing I would say is surf the surge. Surf the surge. What do I mean by that? Well, our belief is right now that because of all of this trade friction, billions of dollars of global investment are being held back at the moment by businesses. They are reticent to invest. So if resolution is actually going to happen, who are the businesses that would capitalize most on the unleashing of all of that pent-up investment? Well, it's those who are actually looking for it now and are ready to ride that wave when it arrives. And others will be sort of flitting around with their surfboards, wondering if this really is the right wave or not. You'll be standing up on yours, and you'll be ready to ride this wave, and it'll be the ride of your life, I believe. So go for the gap, surf the surge. The third piece of advice I would say is dare to diversify. The fast-growing markets of the world for a long, long time to come will be in the non-traditional space for Canada. They will be in emerging markets. They will be the Chinas, the Indias, the Vietnams, the Indonesias, the Brazils, the Chiles, the Colombias of the world, even the Mexicos eventually of the world. Those are the economies with the greatest amount of growth promise as we go forward. So I'd say those three things are probably the top pieces of advice that I could share with Atlantic Canadian businesses. You can do it. The opportunity is actually there right now. A space has been created for you. And I would encourage you, as a financial institution who's ready to stand behind these words, we at EDC would encourage you to think about things that way.
Well, thank you, Peter Hall. That's a great way to finish this session. And I know EDC's got a lot of programs and services to provide for businesses on a very practical way, but you and your team also are a wealth of information and insight. So we very much appreciate you taking the time today to answer the questions from this region and to give your advice on how to navigate some of these global trade risks and how to be successful globally. So again, thank you very much for taking your time. I'd also like to thank everyone. Thank you, Peter. So thank you, everyone, for joining in, for submitting your questions. We will be sending you out a short survey just to get your feedback on today's session. So please just take a few seconds to respond to that. With that, I'd just like to thank both Peter and everyone for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this session. Again, I apologize for the slight loss of Peter's video and the pause that we had there with some technical issues. But again, I hope this has been very valuable. Thanks very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you at a future APEC webinar next week or our Outlook conference coming up this fall. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Peter. It's been great.